They mocked her every single day. The maid with her faded dress, her calloused hands, and her quiet eyes that seemed to hold more than she ever spoke. But no one was laughing when the wealthy young son reached out, wrapped his small arms around her waist, and whispered one word that silenced the room: "Mommy." This isn't just another story about cruelty, pride, or even love. It's about how easy it is to underestimate someone who doesn't fit the world's idea of success, and how dangerous it is to laugh at people without knowing the truth behind their lives. Today, you're about to hear a story that will turn judgment into shame, pity into respect, and laughter into stunned silence. In this video, we'll walk through the life of a woman who carried the weight of both poverty and dignity on her shoulders, and the cruel mockery she endured in a house that wasn't hers. You'll see how every insult, every laugh, and every dismissive glance built up to a single, unforgettable moment. A moment that would flip the entire room upside down. Now, if you've ever judged someone too quickly, or been judged yourself for what you wore, what you earned, or where you came from, this story is going to hit close. It's a reminder that every life has a chapter no one else can see, and sometimes the punchline people laugh at is only the setup for a bigger revelation. So stay with me, because once we dive in, you'll see how the maid everyone ridiculed turned out to be the heart of the story, and why the little boy's voice carried more truth than all the adults in the room combined. Her name was Maria. She was not yet 40, though her face carried the weary grace of someone who had weathered many storms. To the outside world, she was just another housemaid. The kind who rose before dawn, tied her hair back without a second thought, and slipped into the same plain dress that had faded from black to gray over years of washing. She wore no perfume, no jewelry, and no bright smile to make herself noticeable. To the family she served, she was invisible, until, of course, they needed something. Maria had been working in the Alvarez household for nearly 6 years. The Alvarez family was wealthy, respected, and proud of their place in the community. Mr. Alvarez was a businessman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper wardrobe. Mrs. Alvarez was the sort of woman who dressed for brunch as though she were headed to a gala. And their circle of friends was just like them, well-dressed, well-spoken, and quick to laugh at anyone who didn't belong. From the first day Maria entered their home, she noticed how quickly the laughter followed her. It was never the loud, careless laughter of joy. It was sharper, laced with mockery. They laughed at her old shoes. They laughed at the way she spoke, because her accent carried the music of the rural countryside. They laughed at the way she walked quietly into a room and bent her head when she answered. The cruelty was subtle at first. Little smirks when she passed by. A whispered comment when she served tea. But cruelty, left unchecked, never stays small. It grows bold. Within months, they were no longer whispering. They laughed out loud. They asked her whether she had ever seen the inside of a boutique. They joked that the rag she used to wipe the tables was probably worth more than her entire wardrobe. They said it while sipping coffee she had brewed, while sitting in chairs she had polished, while wearing clothes she had carefully pressed with her tired hands. Maria never answered back. Not because she lacked pride, but because she had learned long ago that answering cruelty with anger only feeds it. Instead, she lowered her eyes, tucked the sting deep inside her chest, and kept working. But silence has its own cost. Every day she swallowed their laughter, it carved another line in her heart. What no one knew, what no one even thought to ask, was why Maria worked so hard, why she endured so much. Because Maria's story didn't begin in the Alvarez mansion. It began in a small town miles away, in a modest house with peeling paint and a garden that smelled of earth after rain. That was where she had once lived with her husband, Carlos, and their little boy, Samuel. Carlos had been a construction worker, strong and proud, with dreams bigger than his paycheck. Maria had stayed home in those years, caring for Samuel, singing to him at night, braiding his hair into little curls when he was a toddler. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Until one rainy afternoon, Carlos never came home from the site. A collapsed scaffold. A call from the foreman. A body brought back draped in silence. Maria's world cracked that day. She held Samuel in her arms, barely 4 years old, and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She promised him food on the table, a roof over their heads, and a chance to finish school. But promises don't pay bills, and soon the debtors began to circle. So Maria left Samuel in the care of her aging mother and went looking for work in the city. Housekeeping jobs were all she could find. At first she thought it would be temporary. Just long enough to steady her feet. But temporary has a way of turning permanent, especially when doors keep slamming in your face. The Alvarez household paid better than most, but it also demanded more. The chores were endless, the hours unforgiving, and the humiliation constant. Still, Maria endured. Every paycheck she sent home went straight into Samuel's school fees, straight into medicine when her mother fell sick, straight into the promise she had made on the day she buried her husband. Yet no one in the Alvarez household ever thought to wonder why she worked so hard. To them, she was background scenery. A fixture of the home, as replaceable as the curtains. And so, when guests visited, it became a sort of unspoken sport to laugh at her. They laughed not because she had done anything wrong, but because mocking someone beneath them made them feel taller. But children see what adults miss. And in that house lived 6-year-old Daniel Alvarez, the only son of Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez. Daniel was curious, bright-eyed, and still unspoiled by the arrogance of the adults around him. When he watched Maria sweep the floor, he didn't see a maid. He saw the woman who always tied his shoelaces when the nanny was too busy scrolling her phone. He saw the woman who remembered that he hated the crust on his sandwiches. He saw the woman who hummed lullabies under her breath that somehow made the nightmares go away. Maria never set out to win Daniel's heart. She was careful not to overstep. But children know love when they feel it, and Daniel felt safer in Maria's quiet presence than in the polished, perfumed arms of the adults who barely looked up from their champagne glasses. And so, while the adults laughed, Daniel began to draw closer to her. He asked her questions. He tugged at her skirt when he wanted attention. He sat at the kitchen table watching her knead dough as though it were magic. Slowly, a bond grew, one that neither Maria nor the Alvarez family fully understood, but one that would change everything. The trouble began on a Sunday afternoon when the Alvarezes hosted one of their many social gatherings. The house was buzzing with laughter, music, and the clinking of expensive glasses. The kind of gathering where every woman arrived draped in jewels, and every man spoke louder than the last, competing for attention. Maria had been running back and forth since morning, polishing silverware, ironing linens, preparing trays of hors d'oeuvres she couldn't even pronounce. By the time guests arrived, her back ached, her hair had fallen loose from its bun, and sweat clung to her forehead. She moved silently, as always, carrying trays from the kitchen to the lounge. The guests barely glanced at her, except when they had something cruel to say. One of the women, her lipstick the color of wine, smirked as Maria set down a plate of pastries. "Careful," she said loudly enough for others to hear. She might drop it. Probably not used to handling anything this expensive. The group chuckled, sipping their drinks, while Maria lowered her gaze and whispered, "Yes, ma'am." But what stung most was not the words themselves. It was the casualness. The way they laughed as though her dignity were an endless supply of entertainment. As though her silence made her less human, less real. They didn't know that every insult cut deeper than the one before. They didn't know that when Maria went to her tiny room in the attic at night, she would sit on the edge of her narrow bed and hold her son's photo in her hands, whispering apologies for not being home with him. Daniel noticed. He was standing by the doorway, half hidden behind the tall chairs, when the women mocked her. His small fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to say something, to defend the woman who tucked him in at night, but his young voice would have been drowned out by laughter. Instead, he waited until Maria passed by with an empty tray and tugged gently at her skirt. "Don't listen to them," he whispered. His words were small, but to Maria, they were a balm. She forced a smile and nodded, but inside, her chest swelled with gratitude. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern repeated itself. The adults laughed, and Daniel watched. Maria endured, and Daniel quietly grew closer to her. He began spending more time in the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly baked bread felt more comforting than the perfumed air of the living room. He would ask her questions, about the songs she hummed, about the stories of her hometown. Slowly, Maria allowed herself to share pieces of her past, though never everything. She told him about the mango trees she used to climb as a girl, about the rains that turned the fields green, about the fireflies that lit up the nights in her village. Daniel listened with wide eyes, more interested in her tales than in the expensive toys his parents kept buying to occupy him. To him, Maria wasn't just a maid. She was warmth, patience, and love wrapped in one. He began to call her Tia in secret, a term of affection he had heard in school. Maria corrected him gently, reminding him she was only the maid, but in his heart, the bond was deeper than words could define. The problem grew worse one evening when Mr. Alvarez invited a few business partners for dinner. The men drank heavily, their laughter growing louder with each glass of whiskey. Maria served them carefully, balancing trays with the precision of someone who knew what even a small mistake would cost her. But as she leaned forward to place a dish on the table, one of the men sneered. "Tell me, Señora," he said, exaggerating the word as though it were a joke. "How much does my friend pay you to play house here?" The table erupted with laughter. Mr. Alvarez did nothing. Mrs. Alvarez smirked. Maria's cheeks burned, but she kept her head down. Daniel, sitting at the far end of the table, heard every word. He saw the way Maria's hands trembled as she set down the plate. He saw the way her lips pressed together, holding back words she would never dare speak. Something inside him twisted, and for the first time, he felt ashamed, not of Maria, but of the family name he carried. That night, when Maria retreated to her small room, she found a folded note slipped under her door. The handwriting was messy, but she recognized it instantly, Daniel's. The note said simply, "You're my favorite person in this house." Maria pressed the paper to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. But the cruelest blow came weeks later, when Mrs. Alvarez decided to host a charity luncheon. The event was meant to showcase the family's generosity, though everyone knew it was more about flaunting wealth than helping the poor. Maria had been working tirelessly for days, polishing the silver, setting the tables, preparing food under the cook's instructions. By the time guests arrived, the house gleamed, the air filled with laughter and clinking glasses. Maria hovered in the background, ready to serve at a moment's notice. But the laughter started again. This time, it was sharper. One woman pointed at her shoes, cracked from years of use, and said loudly, "Imagine walking around in those. I'd rather go barefoot." Another added, "Well, she probably doesn't know the difference. For her, this is luxury." The room roared with laughter. And then, as if to crown their cruelty, one of the guests asked, "Do you even know what brand these dishes are?" holding up a porcelain plate. Maria whispered, "No, ma'am." The woman smirked. "Exactly. Why would you?" Daniel was in the room that day. He froze when he heard their words, his small heart pounding. He watched Maria lower her eyes, her hands tightening on the tray she carried. Something inside him broke. He couldn't understand why the people he was supposed to admire were so cruel to the person he loved most. To him, it was madness. That was the beginning of the end. The challenge had been laid bare. Maria's silence could no longer shield her from humiliation, and Daniel's innocence could no longer hide his anger. Both were being pushed toward a moment neither of them could avoid, a moment when truth would burst into the open. After the charity luncheon, Maria's life inside the Alvarez mansion felt heavier than ever. It wasn't only the chores or the endless hours, it was the weight of carrying her dignity in a place determined to strip it away. Every glance from the guests, every smirk from Mrs. Alvarez, every careless laugh when she entered the room pressed down on her shoulders like stones. But Maria had learned long ago how to carry stones. Each night, she would return to her little attic room, sit on her narrow bed, and write letters to her son Samuel. Letters she could never send. She wrote about the things she wanted to tell him, how much she missed the sound of his laughter, how proud she was of his school grades, how every day without him felt like a piece of her heart had gone missing. She folded each letter carefully and tucked it into a tin box she kept hidden beneath her bed. Someday, she told herself, she would give it to him. Someday, when the sacrifices were over, he would understand. Daniel became her only light in that house. He followed her like a shadow, always curious, always full of questions. Unlike the adults, he didn't see her plain dress or her worn shoes. He saw the kindness in her hands when she bandaged his scraped knee after he fell in the garden. He saw the patience in her voice when she helped him with homework, even though she herself had only finished school up to the 8th grade. He saw the tenderness in her eyes when he cried quietly after a nightmare and she sat by his bed until he fell asleep again. At first, Maria tried to discourage his closeness. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that she was only the maid. But Daniel wouldn't hear it. "You're not just the maid," he whispered one afternoon when she caught him sneaking cookies from the kitchen. "You're my favorite." Maria's heart tightened. She wanted to correct him, to tell him that his mother would be hurt if she heard those words. But she also couldn't lie to herself. For Daniel, she had become something more. Something the adults had failed to be for him: present, gentle, real. The cruelty of the Alvarez circle, however, did not lessen. In fact, it worsened. Perhaps they noticed Daniel's closeness to her. Perhaps they simply grew bored of their usual targets and found it amusing to sharpen their barbs against her even more. Whatever the reason, their mockery became bolder. One evening, when Maria was serving drinks, a guest stopped her with a laugh. "Tell me," he said, "do you ever dream of being more than this? Or is scrubbing floors the height of ambition where you come from?" The others chuckled, some hiding their smirks behind wine glasses. Maria answered softly, "I dream of many things, sir." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what is it you dream of?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "That my son will grow up with better chances than I had." For the first time, the room fell silent. Not out of respect, but out of discomfort. Her words had sliced through their shallow laughter, reminding them that beneath her uniform was a beating heart, a mother's hope, a woman's dignity. But the silence lasted only a moment before someone muttered, "Well, good luck with that," and the laughter resumed. Daniel heard. And though his young mind didn't fully understand the layers of cruelty, he understood enough. That night, he told Maria, "When I grow up, I'll buy you new shoes. And I'll make everyone be nice to you." She smiled, brushing his hair back, whispering, "You just grow up kind, Daniel. That will be enough." But the house itself seemed designed to test her. Mrs. Alvarez, noticing Daniel's growing attachment, began to tighten the rules. She scolded Maria for letting the boy linger in the kitchen. She snapped at her for spending too much time on his homework. "You're here to clean, not to mother him," she hissed one evening when Daniel wasn't around. The word struck deep, because that was exactly what Maria feared, crossing a line she had no right to cross. And yet, Maria couldn't help it. Her love for children was woven into her being. To give warmth, to offer guidance, to soothe, it came as naturally as breathing. She didn't see it as replacing anyone. She simply gave what her heart carried, and Daniel, hungry for affection, drank it in like water. The tension came to a head one afternoon when Daniel had a small birthday gathering. A few of his classmates were invited, along with their parents. The Alvarez mansion was decorated with balloons and ribbons, tables lined with cakes and sweets that gleamed under the lights. The adults mingled, sipping champagne, while the children played games in the garden. Maria worked tirelessly that day, ensuring every detail was perfect. But when she came out to serve the cake, one of the mothers laughed as she saw Daniel rush to Maria, tugging at her hand. "Is that your nanny?" she asked, smiling thinly. Daniel, without hesitation, shook his head. "No. She's He stopped, glancing at Maria, who looked at him quickly with pleading eyes. He swallowed his words, then said, "She's my friend." The woman chuckled. "Well, isn't that sweet?" But her tone carried mockery, and the others joined in. Maria felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She pulled her hand away gently, forcing a smile as she retreated to the kitchen. Later that night, Daniel slipped into her attic room, clutching a piece of cake in his hands. "Why didn't you let me say it?" he whispered. "Say what, Niño?" Maria asked softly, though she knew. "That you're like my mommy," he said. Her throat tightened. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. She shook her head. "Daniel, you have a mother. A wonderful one who loves you very much." He frowned. "She doesn't love me like you do." Maria's heart broke. She gathered him into her arms, hugging him tightly. "Shoo," she whispered, rocking him gently. "Don't say that. You must never say that." But inside, she knew the truth of his words. The weeks that followed grew heavier. Maria's sacrifices continued, sending money home, writing unsent letters, holding her pain in silence. And Daniel's attachment only deepened, his small acts of defiance growing bolder. He began correcting guests when they mocked her. He refused to eat unless she sat nearby. He told anyone who asked that Maria was the best part of his home. It was dangerous, Maria knew. She could lose her job. She could lose everything. But how could she pull away from a child who needed her? A child who, in many ways, mirrored her own son? The Alvarez family and their friends remained blind to the bond forming under their noses. To them, Maria was still invisible, still nothing but a shadow in the corner of their glittering world. But shadows can hold power, and Maria's shadow was growing long across Daniel's life. And then came the day when laughter would finally choke in their throats, and Daniel's small voice would shatter the walls of pride. It happened on a night meant for display. Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez were hosting one of the grandest dinners of the season. Important business associates, politicians, and socialites crowded into the lavishly decorated hall. Crystal chandeliers glowed, silver cutlery sparkled, and laughter spilled from every corner of the house like champagne overflowing its glass. Maria had been working since dawn. Her hands were raw from polishing, her back sore from carrying, but she moved with quiet precision, as always. The cook barked orders, the butler fussed over details, and through it all Maria made sure every corner gleamed, every dish arrived on time, every guest was satisfied. She was invisible, yet essential, the unseen thread holding the entire evening together. But the guests did not see her service. They saw only her uniform, her plainness, her silence. And so the whispers began again. By the time dinner was served, the whispers had grown into open mockery. One man, swirling a glass of wine, remarked loudly, "I've seen waitresses in cafes better dressed than this maid. Do they pay her at all, or just let her live in the attic for free?" The table chuckled. Another woman, her diamonds catching the light, added, "Maybe she chooses to look that way. Some people simply don't know refinement." Maria kept her head down as she served the plates, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Each word felt like a lash across her back. But she stayed silent. She always stayed silent. Daniel, seated between his parents, heard everything. His little heart pounded as he watched Maria shrink beneath their laughter. He gripped his fork tightly, his knuckles white, his chest burning with words he had been told never to speak. And then, it happened. As Maria leaned forward to serve dessert, one of the women sneered, "Careful with that tray, maid. If you drop it, we'll deduct it from your wages." The laughter was cruel, sharp, echoing across the table like glass shattering. Daniel slammed his fork down. The sound startled the table into silence. His small voice, high but steady, rang out in the hush. "Stop laughing at her." Every head turned. The boy, who was usually quiet, well-mannered, suddenly blazing with fury. Mr. Alvarez frowned, his jaw tightening. "Daniel," he began, but the boy stood on his chair, his eyes shining with tears. "She's not just the maid," Daniel said, his voice trembling but loud enough for every guest to hear. "She's my mommy." The words fell into the room like a thunderclap. The guests froze. Forks clattered onto plates. Mrs. Alvarez's wine glass slipped from her hand, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a wound. Maria gasped, her tray nearly tipping from her hands. "No, Niño," she whispered, panic in her voice. But Daniel was unshakable. He looked around the table, his small chest heaving. "She's my mommy," he repeated, louder this time. "She takes care of me. She tucks me in at night. She loves me when nobody else does. She's my mommy." The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in a storm of shocked whispers. Some guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others tried to stifle nervous chuckles, unsure how to respond. Mr. Alvarez's face burned with rage. Mrs. Alvarez's lips tightened into a thin, trembling line. Maria stood frozen, her heart thundering in her chest. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear, to shield Daniel from the fury she knew would come. Yet at the same time, tears blurred her vision. Because in his innocent truth, Daniel had given her the one gift no one had ever dared: recognition. "Daniel!" Mrs. Alvarez's voice cracked, sharp as a whip. "Sit down this instant." But the boy shook his head stubbornly, tears streaking his cheeks. "No. You don't love me the way she does. You don't even see me. But she does. She always does. And I don't care if you don't like it, she's my mommy." The guests stared, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The air was thick with unease. For the first time, the mocking laughter had died. For the first time, the people who had ridiculed Maria were forced to look at her not as an object of amusement, but as a woman who had inspired a child's fiercest love. Maria could hardly breathe. She set the tray down with shaking hands and hurried to Daniel's side. She knelt beside his chair, cupping his face gently. "Shoo, mi niño," she whispered. "Don't cry. Don't say things that will get you in trouble." "But it's true," he sobbed, clinging to her. "You're my mommy." The sight silenced even the cruelest tongues in the room. The boy clinging to the maid, his sobs raw, her arms wrapped around him with the kind of love that no wealth could buy. The Alvarez parents sat in stunned humiliation, their reputations unraveling before their guests' eyes. For all their wealth, their child's heart belonged not to them, but to the woman they mocked. And in that moment, the laughter that had followed Maria for years finally died. It did not return.